Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm going to share something, probably says a whole lot about how I'm wired up, but I'm not going to use the hate word, but I have a strong, intensely strong dislike of waiting. I really, really do. I mean, I don't know. I just feel like I'm about ready to crawl out of my skin. In fact, I want to hearken back to a day and age. Some of you may remember this when the Walmarts actually had checkout lines everywhere, and it's before self-checkout. That to me was always like an immense amount of mental gymnastics went into choosing a line. Anybody with me? You would walk through. For me, I would not just count heads in line. I would look into carts to make sure, to kind of evaluate how many items are we looking at. I would even go as far as to look at the checkout person. Do they look like they know what they do? Do they look like they like their job? Different things like that. Are they talking to the person that is first in line at that point in time? That always adds seconds, right? And then are the people in line, are they like social butterflies as well? And they're talking to one another? I'm like, okay, not that one. You go to another one. So anybody like that? Or am I the only person on the face of the planet that hates waiting? So let me ask this question, though. How many of you struggle waiting on God? Waiting on God. I'll be honest with you, that is a tough thing for many people. We oftentimes really struggle with the fact that, we want to be the Christian that says God makes all things perfect in His time. But we struggle because there's a loved one who maybe is not walking with Jesus, and we continue to pray for them, and we don't see God answering the prayer. Or we might be dealing with a marriage issue. In fact, this weekend was our marriage retreat here at Valley View, and you struggle. Many people are like, I pray for this, and I pray for my spouse, and it just doesn't seem like anything is happening. Or that's the inside stuff that nobody really gets to see unless they're really, really close to you. But it's the depression, it's the anxiety, it's the regret and the worry, and all those different things that we carry around and we ask God to do something with, and He doesn't seem to be in a big hurry of acting. So I guess the question really kind of comes down to this, is what do we do with a God who's not in a hurry? I read a book many years ago called An Unhurried Life that said that Jesus is always going somewhere, but He's never in a hurry. And I think about that, and I think about our own lives where sometimes we get that. God, you're just not in a big hurry. And if you're ever struggled with that, I think this is maybe going to speak into your life just a little bit here this morning. But I want to let you know that this morning we're going to begin a new series. We're going to skip the rock through the book of Exodus. Over the next 13 weeks, we're going to have two different series in which we're going to look into different facets and those big stories within the book of Exodus. But here is what we read as we begin. Kind of one of those things that's setting the stage a little bit. These are the names of the sons of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants, including Joseph, who was already there. So, setting the stage, Jacob's family moves to Egypt. But I think we need to understand a little bit about what led to this. Now, going back to Genesis 12, kind of a big part in the entire Bible, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, God calls Abram, and He makes promises to him that he will have a family. Abraham didn't have a family at that point in time. That family will become a nation. That nation will inherit the land. From that nation, from Abraham, will come a worldwide blessing. And so God is making promises, and He reaffirmed those promises to Isaac and to Jacob. But a big portion of the book of Genesis, especially the last 20 chapters or so, really focus in on the life of Joseph. Joseph, a favored son of Jacob, is sold by his brothers into slavery, which ends him up in Egypt, where he rises to power because he's able to interpret the dreams that Pharaoh is having and no one else can interpret them. And he says that there's going to be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh puts him in charge of making storehouses and preparing for that famine, which allowed for Jacob and his family to buy grain from Egypt, and eventually revealed that Joseph is still alive, and the family ends up in Egypt, which is kind of where we begin our story here today. But in Exodus chapter 1, we read of a baby boom. We read of a massive population increase that happened within the Israelite people. And because of that, the new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, the Pharaoh subsequently began to be a little bit concerned about the population of the Israelites compared to the population of the Egyptians. Like, this is going to be a problem. So Pharaoh puts in forced labor and slavery, which does not alleviate the problem. Baby boom is still continuing. So then he says to the midwives, if it comes out a boy, kill it. If it comes out a boy, kill it. Annihilate that, so as to stop the growth of the nation. And when the midwives honored God and disobeyed Pharaoh, he said, okay, here's the deal. Every child, every boy child under 2 is to be put to death. Very similar to what happened during the day and age of Jesus. And basically what I've covered from the time they came into to Egypt to the end of Genesis chapter 1 is 320 years. And I want you to put that in the back of your mind, because in Exodus chapter 2, we discover that there is an Israelite couple. They have a baby. This baby, they look at him and they say there's something special about him. And so they hide the baby in their house for the next 3 months, really defying the decree of Pharaoh. And when the baby got too big, they had made a basket and put tar and pitch in the basket and put the basket in the Nile River. And Pharaoh's daughter comes along, sees the baby, says, he's going to be mine. And of course, the baby's sister is watching from a distance. And as she's watching from a distance, she goes up and says, would you like a Hebrew nurse to come along and to provide? And of course, that is the baby's mother. Now, if you don't know, this is the story, the beginning of the life of Moses. And in chapter 2, verse 10, we read something interesting about Moses and his name. It says, later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. And the name Moses literally means draw out or drawn out, which becomes very important in the life and ministry of Moses and how he serves God. Now we're going to fast forward to when Moses is an adult, because understanding that he was raised Hebrew, but he was also raised Egyptian. So in many ways we call this dual citizenship. But with dual citizenship, the problem is eventually you're going to have to choose. You're going to have to choose where your loyalty lies. And let's look at verses 11 and 12. It says, many years later, so he's an adult, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During this visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure that no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Reality. Moses clearly placed himself on the side of the Hebrews, clearly placed himself in line, in alignment with the Israelite people and nation. But with that, this is not the end of the story, because there is a tomorrow. There's the next day. And in verses 13 and 14, it says, the next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one who started the fight. The man replied, who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday? Now, it's interesting when you look at this is who appointed you to be prince or ruler and judge? If you read a little bit farther along in the story, the answer is God. God appointed him to be ruler and judge. Many believe what Moses was trying to do when he killed the Egyptian guy, is that he believed that he was actually the guy that was going to draw the Israelites out of Egypt. But it wasn't God's time. And so Moses flees to the Midian wilderness, and when he gets to a certain place, he sits down beside a well, and 7 daughters of Jethro come up, and they're shepherds, and they have their flock, and then other shepherds come up and start kind of irritating the young women, and Moses again comes to their defense, and they invite him home, and Jethro invites him in, and eventually Moses marries one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah. They have a son, and what we find is Moses spends the next 40 years in anonymity, 40 years as a shepherd out in the wilderness. I happen to believe that God needed that 40 years to do something in the life and heart of Moses to prepare for him what God had planned all along. But again, 40 years of God working in a person's life. That doesn't necessarily always fit into our timing. But then we get to verse 23. It says, years passed, and the king of Egypt died. But the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. So there's a couple of things here in this verse that are pretty important in the larger scope of the book of Exodus and the narrative of Exodus. Years passed. And so when we think about that, there's a lot of years that are happening here. And if we think about the average lifespan of a person, we would say over half of a person's life had passed in Moses. I mean, this is a long time of years past, but also from the scope of years from the time they arrived in Egypt till today. In addition to this, the Pharaoh that wanted to kill or execute Moses for doing what he did is now dead. So the threat of execution, the threat of paying for his crime is no longer there. But also the Israelites cry out to God. They continue to groan, but it says, and they cried out, and it rose up to God. And some have suggested, and I think this is a pretty cool way of looking at it, that the Israelites reached the point where discomfort outweighed comfort. That sometimes change is not readily accepted until we reach that place where the discomfort outweighs the comfort in our lives. And so that's kind of where we are. And then we get to verse 23 and 24, where it says, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel, and he knew it was time to act. And I love the picture here. God is not confined in any way. What he does here does not limit his abilities in any way, but it puts human actions into what God did here. So, God looked down. And I think that's, he first heard. He heard Israel's cries. And after hearing, it says that he remembered. He remembered the promises that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is not as though God had forgotten. It's in no way. He looked, and the idea of looking is that he considered. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was like intently. He saw what was happening, and then what it actually says here literally is that, and God knew, or God knows. The implication here is that as God knows all this, considers all of this, he now knows it is time to act. And personally, when I hear and I read about the actions of God here, I think there's great comfort for us. I think there's great comfort in knowing that God hears us. He hears our cries. He hears our prayers. He understands our groans. In fact, tells us in the New Testament that the Spirit intercedes for us to kind of say, hey, listen, I know this is what they said, but this is what they really meant. This is their heart. And so God hears us. It's not like he's up in heaven going, la, 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 la. I cannot hear you, right? That's not what he is doing. Also, he remembered, and I think about what God remembers his word. And so one of the verses of the New Testament that I always cling to comes out of Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. It's this right here, being confident of this. Paul's he's talking to the church and what God is going to do, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. So there's a couple of things that I always pull from this. One, God has a work that he wants to do within his church. I also believe that God has a work that he wants to do in your life, and that he will be faithful to bring that work to completion. Now, that will not always look the way that we think it ought to work, but God is going to continue to work. But not just that, until the day of Christ Jesus, and until his second coming, God is going to be working in the hearts, lives, and minds of people. And that should bring great comfort to us, and to know that God sees. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people. This is probably one of the things that I would say probably is true of where I've been many times in my life, where people say, I just feel invisible. Do you ever feel invisible? Like you don't matter to people, that people don't recognize you, like they don't give you a second thought? God sees you, and but not just that. It says God knows. In fact, one of the things that's introduced to us in the New Testament that I think is such an incredible, beautiful picture is God is Father. Not just like this big, sovereign, powerful God, but God is Father. And as a father, I love what it talks about in Matthew chapter 7, that if earthly fathers know how to give good gifts to their children, how much more is God going to give good gifts to those who call on him, recognize him as Father? And so God knows you, and he knows what is best for you. And so I love this. But what gives me fits is the timing. What gives me fits is Genesis chapter 15. Verses 13, 14, where God is prophesying, like, this is what's going to happen. This is what he's telling Abraham. In Genesis chapter 15, he says this, Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end, they will come away with great wealth. So God does not seem to be in a big hurry. I want you to think 400 years. 400 years. 400 years ago. It's 5 years after the Mayflower landed in America. 1625, we were just colonizing this place. Think about all of the changes that have happened in the world in the last 400 years. And so you think about that, and God, I just have to ask the question, why did it take him so long to act? Why did it take him 400 years to get to that place of now I'm going to do this? And I think one of the great challenges that we are going to struggle with as we walk with Jesus, as we wrestle with God over things that either happen or do not happen, will all be centered around the timing of God. Like, we just don't understand that. Like, why did he take a loved one when he did? Why did this person get sick when they did? Why did this happen when it did? Why hasn't God done something about? In fact, if you read the book of Psalms, the book of Psalms is a large part of it. The psalmists are saying, God, why haven't you? And why did you? And why is it taking so long for you to take care of this? And listen, in many ways, I get a front row seat to many of y'all's lives. There's a lot of people that I've walked with for a long time here in this room. But every week, I get to read your prayer requests. And one of my continual prayers is I thank God for the saints at Valley View that trust us as leaders to pray for them. But I know that many of you have for years prayed for loved ones to come to Jesus. I know that for many of you, you've been praying for physical healing for years. That the issues of depression and anxiety and deep-seated hurt had just become part of who you are. And so, one thing that I'm certain of is God never operates according to our timeline. And so we struggle with that. And, you know, we love to quote verses. In fact, I'm certain, probably, maybe, I don't know, a vague thing in my mind. I think there was a picture in my house when I was a kid. It's been a long time ago. Of Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. You know, but they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. But we love to quote verses like this, but in many ways we wish these verses would say, God will get going when we ask him to. But I want to go back to when Moses murdered the man in Egypt. I remember something that one of my professors said about Moses here. Dr. Wallace was from West Texas. I actually learned Hebrew in a West Texas accent, by the way. That was fun. But I remember Dr. Wallace saying something when we were going through the books of Moses in one of the classes, is that Moses really was wanting to live out what he believed was his vision and mission in life. That he truly believed that he was here on this planet to draw God's people out of Egypt. But I remember him saying this: Moses was ready to lead before he was ready to lead. God wasn't ready for him to do what he felt like he was called to do. And God needed to take and draw Moses out of Egypt to the wilderness and to do the work in Moses' life before Moses could lead his people out of Egypt. Also, we go back to the fact that maybe the discomfort reached the place where it was greater than the discomfort or the comfort of the people. And they were ready for change. And so in the grand scheme of things, I think about Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. Paul writes this about Jesus, but he says this, but when the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law so that he could adopt us as his very own children. Jesus came, and I'm thoroughly convinced, and I could preach a sermon on it now, but I won't, that there were so many things that lined up just perfectly in culture and history and every facet of life where God said, now is the time for my son to come. And when I look at 400 years, God took a family of 70 and made them a mighty nation. I look at the life of Moses. Moses is 40, still wet behind the ears. God says, no, I need another 40 years of molding and shaping this man to where he is ready to lead my people out. You see, in the fullness of time, after God heard and he remembered and he looked and he knew, he acted. And over the next several weeks, actually 7 weeks including today, we're going to look at ways that God acted and moved in human history. He inserted himself. And one of the things that we can say as God inserts himself in this moment right here is that the book of Exodus shows us God inserting himself in human history unlike any other time, with the exception of the person of Jesus. And so here's my bottom line for today before we move on. Exodus is a narrative of God acting in human history to keep his promise. And so I can take a look at this and say he acted to keep his promise. I can look at he took a family and made them a nation. He gave them a land. After giving them the land, they grew. They again expanded as a nation. And eventually, through Abraham's line, he brought a worldwide blessing who is Jesus. And so I can look and say God has acted and will continue to act in human history. But with all this, we may struggle with God's timing. I don't want to be a downer. I tend to be that guy. My wife will sometimes look at me, not disrespectfully, and say, every party has a pooper, and this party has you. So I don't want to be that guy today. But I do want to say this. You may never see what you pray for in this lifetime. I have personally lived situations in my life where a person comes to Jesus and they make a decision, and at their baptism, another family member will say, Grandma prayed for him every day before she died. You may never see the faithfulness of God's timing in your lifetime. But I will tell us this. I do think there's something to do while we wait. And while we wait for healing, and while we wait for God to answer those crying out to God sort of prayers, I want to challenge us with a few items here this morning. Typically, we do head, heart, and hands. But I want to kind of abandon that here today and elaborate just a little bit more on some really practical ways that we can wait on God, that we can wait for God's faithfulness. And one of them is this. In fact, I might say, you may want to take out your phones because I'm going to throw a lot out at you over the next 5 or 6 minutes. Examine yourself in the waiting. And I think about this. Whether we know it or not, a lot of our prayers, the things that we cry out to God about, are selfish on our part. Not to say it's bad, but tend to be a little selfish when we pray. And so maybe a good thing to do while we're waiting on God is examine ourselves. In fact, in Psalm 139, it talks about this. It says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life. So take the time of waiting on God, and don't complain about God, but examine yourself. Look inside and say, like, what's wrong with me that might need to change? Also this, avoid comparison. I've heard that comparison is the enemy of joy. And it is so easy. It is so easy to look around us and look at the public self of other people and go, I wish I had their life. I wish I had their home. I wish I had their jobs. I wish I had their car. My goodness, I wish I had their kids. Like their kids are perfect, right? Their marriage is perfect. That's what we think. But I have clung to a particular verse, actually two verses, the last many years of my life. Hebrews 12, 1 through 2. One of the things that I cling to in this is where it says in verse 1, and let us run with endurance the race God has marked out for us. Now that us is the church. But I look at this and understand that every single one of us in this room has a course marked out for us, specifically designed by God, and we don't get to live somebody else's life. And so we need to avoid the comparison thing and be faithful with the course that God has placed before us, that we faithfully live that life. Also, embrace the season of waiting. Now, I've got some questions here. At least the heart of these questions were found somewhere where I read something one time, and I can't remember who said this, but it's good. It's asking God, what do you want me to know about you in this season? You see, sometimes God's probably like waving, like, I just want you to know this about me right now. What do we need to know about God as we're in a season of waiting? Also, how are you wanting to change me through this season? Again, that's self-examination thing. Like, God, while I wait, is there something that you need to do in me and through me? In addition to that, what are you wanting me to know about me through this season? Like, it tells us in the book of James that looking into God's word is like looking into a mirror. I have discovered that as I've aged, and I'm still middle-aged, but when I look in the mirror, I don't see the young guy that used to be in the mirror. I see a lot more gray. I see a lot more wrinkles and spots that didn't used to be there. My wife and I were discussing the top of my head the other day. I said, I've got an island right here, a bridge right here, and an ocean back here. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You see that reality. When we look into God's word, we should see the reality of ourselves. We should see the blemishes and the marks and the scars and those things that reveal who we are. Also, live a quiet life. Live the life that God has designed you to live while you wait. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, it says this: make it your goal to live a quiet life, minding your own business and working with your hands, just as we instructed you before. There's a line from a movie. It's the movie Shawshank Redemption, where the old guy says, actually the young guy, it's time to get busy living or get busy dying. And one of the things that was happening in the Thessalonian church was they were so enthralled with the second coming of Jesus, they weren't living. They just want to sit around and wait for it. And sometimes as we're waiting on Jesus, whatever that might be, it's time to be living. Also, I think as we wait on God, and this may be the hardest thing that we could possibly do, is live expectantly. I know it's hard for me. So I've shared this before. And I'm going to, as I share this, my wife's already gone home for the day, but if you share any medical advice with me, I'm not going to throat punch you, but in my head, I'm throat punching you. 2008, Tara had a hysterectomy. They said that she would be a new person, and the person that happened after that was worse than before. Ask us what's wrong, we don't know. We treat symptoms. Life today is probably better than it has been in a long, long time. But there's still stuff. And when this happened in 2008, I prayed for God to heal her. I prayed for God to heal her. And I anticipated that every time we went to the doctor, that this would be the magic pill that would make her better. But something happened along the way. I still prayed for her. But if I were honest, my prayer was, God, I know you can, but I don't think you ever will. But something happened probably a year ago, I don't know when it was, where I was convicted that I'm going to pray with expectation that God will. That He will. That He is going to do something about this. In fact, my prayer every single day is, God, I know you can. I know you have it in your power. And I want to believe that you will. But something that Tara and I have talked about recently is this. Until that day, we will live for the glory of God. And whenever healing does come, we will live for the glory of God. And so with that, we may not always understand God's timing, but He is a perfect God. I always remind myself of something that Tim Keller said, which was originally something that was said by C.S. Lewis. You would do exactly what God would do if you knew what God knows. So we trust that He is good, and we trust that He is perfect. Will you join me in prayer?